planting or sending letter bombs to various people. He was responsible for killing one of the leading white opposition figures, Ruth First, who was married to Joe Slovo. They were both communists, and I suppose it was deemed that made them fair game. And she was blown up in her office at the university in Maputo, and she was killed. He was also involved in the killing of the family of an Afrikaner, a white Afrikaner dissident named Marius Skoon, whose a letter bomb killed his wife, his daughter, and injured a 2-year-old boy who was left floundering around in this devastated home for 2 days before anyone found him. Yeah, that's the record of Craig Williamson.
That's legendary journalist Alistair Sparks. We spoke to him in Doha 2 years ago. Thomas Frank, now connect him back to what you're talking about today.
That's a really optimistic way to begin the morning. I mean, I'll tell you something. So when you're researching Jack Abramoff, you ultimately wind up researching South Africa, apartheid South Africa, and it's not a happy research subject. It's not a happy thing to learn about. And of course, I was a student at the time in the 80s, and I remember the protests, and I even went on the marches and stuff. But I never did research on, what the apartheid regime was all about, and it was really, really, really unpleasant revisiting that subject and finding out all about it. And we just got a taste of it here. The American right really loved the South African regime, and that's one of the sort of ugly, dark secrets. They don't like to talk about that anymore, but the extent that the lengths that they would go to try to get the South African regime off the hook, get the sanctions undone. Now, this is not to say that they're racists or that they supported apartheid. Nobody supported apartheid, including, if the official South African propaganda organs would say, oh, no, apartheid, hey, it's on its way out, it's
How did Vice President Dick Cheney fit into this?
Cheney, golly, I don't think I have a Cheney link for you. Maybe you've got one you're going to tell me about.
Well, talk more about today and how Jack Abramoff, now in jail, but referring to the permanent government that you refer to.
Well, this is quite a shift. The idea of permanence, you remember it was just 2 years ago when Karl Rove was riding so high, and he would boast all the time about how he and his homies were going to have a permanent majority, and the Republicans were going to be in forever, and it was going to be this paradigm shift in American politics, and well, it didn't work out that way. But after, I read a lot of their sort of commentary about permanence and how they were going to achieve permanence. And what struck me about it is not that so much that they're going to do it by winning elections from here to eternity, which they obviously aren't going to do. They're already out in Congress. But that they would put their, their restructuring of the state, they would cast it in concrete, right? The way that they have totally reconfigured the state, the government down in Washington, they want to make that permanent so that it's irreversible, so that even if a liberal does get in, even if one of my guys gets elected, there's nothing they can do about it. This is the way the state is set up, and, too bad. And they've got all sorts of very interesting, and you got to hand it to these guys. They are ingenious. They've developed all sorts of schemes for making their vision for the government permanent. One of them is what I mentioned earlier, the massive outsourcing and privatizing of federal work. I mean, how are you going to get that back? The best and the brightest have gone through, you referred earlier to the revolving door, this sort of institution in Washington where people who work for the government go out into the private sector and often, then lobby their old colleagues, or they go into the private sector and often do the same job that they were doing before in the federal government, only for a much greater amount of pay. Well, the problem is then you've got this massive brain drain out of the bureaucracies. The best and the brightest don't want to work there anymore because the pay is so low. It's almost like doing charity work or something like that. But the most insidious one, the most insidious scheme for permanence, the one that really strikes me is the use of deficit spending by the right. Okay, now I don't have a problem with deficit spending. You know, it's liberals have used it for decades very effectively. You know, it's if you're a Keynesian, you know, it's one of the tools that you use to say, you know, get the country out of a recession, or build low-income housing, or whatever it is that you want to do with the state, right? So, but the conservatives got into power in the early 1980s, and they're handed this tool, the big old, you know, the power tool of deficit spending, and I'll be damned, they run that sucker right into the ground, you know, and pile up the biggest deficit anyone has ever seen, short of, you know, World War II. And what that does, and that leaves the next administration to come along, which happened to be Bill Clinton, leaves him with this colossal, you know, Everest of debt that he has to deal with. And I don't know if you remember this or not, but before Bill Clinton became what we know of him as today, he was we know him as today. He ran as something of a populist back in 1992. Remember, we were going to get national health care. He was going to have a big public works program. He was going to do this. He was going to do that. And there's this very famous moment where his advisors sat him down in '92 before he was sworn in and told him, I'm sorry, you're not going to be able to do any of those things because the deficit is so huge that the only thing you're going to be able to do as president, the only economic policy you're going to be allowed to have, structurally permitted to have, is deficit reduction. And we know about this because then Clinton went on one of his famous, tirades. He exploded in rage, and anyhow, and now look at Bush doing the same thing, right? So even if Obama does get in, he's not going to have any room to move in terms of a progressive social agenda,
Well, we just have about 30 seconds left, but in your 2004 book, What's the Matter with Kansas, you explored how many people vote against their economic interests. Do you see that happening in 08?
A lot less. I mean, you remember the idea of What's the Matter with Kansas is that the culture wars are a kind of surrogate for class. Remember, the class enemy, instead of being the people who own this country, it's liberals. It's highbrow people. It's people like us. I wear glasses. Something like that. And a war against Christmas and the war against the Ten Commandments and all this kind of nonsense. The really funny thing is that the power of those culture war arguments has really, or some of them anyway, has really vanished in the last 4 years. And that's because one of the other things I said in What's the Matter with Kansas is the economic issues should trump. The real physical issues should trump those cultural issues if the candidates choose to, if the Democratic, the liberal candidates choose to emphasize it that way, to play it that way. And I mean, the public is so angry at the Bush administration right now. I just hope that Obama gets out there and takes advantage of that.
We want to thank you for being with us, Thomas Frank. His new book is called The Wrecking Crew, How Conservatives Rule. And that does it for our broadcast. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Sharif Abdul-Qudus, Aaron Mate, Angela Kamat, Jeffrey Hagerman, Steve Martinez, Nicole Salazar, Hani Massoud, Ravi Karen, Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, Peter Curry's our engineers. Special thanks also to Becca Staley, Ugran Angie Kiefer, Samantha Chamblay. And a very happy birthday to Sharif Abdul-Qudus. He's celebrating the big one this year. And to Nicole Martin, I'm Amy Goodman with Sharif Abdul-Qudus. Thanks for joining us.